Hang on. Got it. Okay, can you see that? Excellent, thank you, Louise. Right, fine. Okay, so yeah, so thank you very much for coming to see my centre-based chair address. As we're doing this virtually, I know there are events planned to do physically for the North East Centre later on, so I wish you good luck in doing those in the new year. But as we are where we are today, this one is virtual. Okay, so I'll just start the ball rolling and set us away. So yes, so what I'm going to talk to you about today is the chair address that I've entitled Dots and Boxes, and I'll explain a bit about why I've called it that in a moment, and I'll do that as part of my introduction, which is the short part of what I'm going to say. The bulkier bit is how did I get here? So it covers a bit of what Louisa talked about in terms of the journey that I've been on as part of my career. And then finally at the end, it's the so what. So what's that got to do with anything in respect of what I'm doing here today with you, and also what I'm doing within the institution that is the IMechE. So as part of the introduction, so there's a bit of a repeat here. So who am I? So as Louise said, so my current job title is Head of Design, and I work in Network Rail. The work, so the work that we do, so it's an in-house design organization. It's 600 people, so quite a small team. If you think about it from Network Rail's terms, Network Rail is about 45,000 people, but it is very much a bunch of multidisciplined design engineers who do some very early stage and also detailed design for all infrastructure disciplines, so that's track, signaling, overhead line, E&P, building, civils, structures, etc. And if you were to ask me what type of an engineer I am, I would actually say I'm a traction rotor stock engineer. I feel like a T&RS engineer. I don't feel like a signal engineer or a track engineer. And that's what I wanted to kind of talk to you a bit about today, really, in terms of engineering, what it's about, and kind of what it feels like, I suppose, as an engineer in our industry. And so, yeah, so we will come back to this in terms of why I feel like a T&RS engineer, despite kind of the role I'm currently doing at the moment. So just to help you to understand a bit about my career path, I've got some summary bits of it. So I was born in the UK. Born in Grimsby, so still kind of northeast-ish, but I grew up, or certainly my formative years were in South Africa, and I was there from the age of about 9 months to 12 and a half years, 13 years old. I won't apologize for the photo, but maybe it's kind of a bit too far in terms of how much you do want to hear about what I'm talking about, but a couple of things to say about it. I'm definitely the small person in the photo, and that's definitely not Grimsby. The sky is far too blue for that, I think. Anyway, having, like I say, done my formative years in Cape Town within South Africa, I came back home, where I, again, was the age of 13, so did O levels and A levels. So those A levels that enabled me to get my route of passage to become an engineer, and I did them in the northeast. So home was Ponteland, so just near the airport, just north of Newcastle, and that's where I kind of spent the rest of my kind of education, which kind of then led me into the world of engineering. Then I went to university, Sheffield, and did mechanical engineering there, and then I had my first flavour of the railway industry at Heaton Depot, again largely because it was local to me at the time, in terms of where I lived. And then, as Louise said, joined British Rail as a graduate engineering management trainee, and then a career of two parts, not two halves, two parts. So the first third of it was very much in traction rolling stock organisations, and the second third of it was with infrastructure stroke traction rolling stock organisations. So that was kind of a quick whiz through as to who I am, and the reason for doing that quickly, that first part, is because I'm going to go into a bit more detail about some of the key parts of my career. But when I am going through it, I'm going to touch on two elements of it. The first is about drivers. So what are the drivers or the catalysts for change that influenced where I went in my career, or how I became who I am today. And then the second part is about some of the experiences or the memorable kind of moments that inspired me to think differently about engineering the railway. So every now and then I'll stop and say, you know, the driver was this, or kind of this was the moment that I experienced as part of that. So yeah, so that's kind of coming towards the end of the introduction. But as a result of all that, what would I say? You know, so what do I know in terms of as a result of doing all that? And one of the things when I was preparing this, the first thing that came to my mind was, I would say to you, the railway is a system. But then I thought about that, and I kind of thought, well, actually, that's becoming a bit of a cliche as we kind of move forward in our ways of working. We talk about the railways being a system, but we tend to think about it, we'll talk about it as an engineering system. We get into the detail, the technical interfaces, and the physical ones, the electronic ones. But engineering is engineering. The laws of physics are the same regardless of which sector you work in or which part of the system you work in. I think I think we often forget that it's about the people that makes the system work. I'm still thinking about engineering, but I'm thinking about the engineers that we have around us that enable that to happen. So for me, it's kind of the people make the difference, and more importantly, it's about what the people do to take advantage of understanding more about the system. So the engineering, come back to engineering, and that's what I've realized that during my career. Has become a key point or a key factor of it. It's about kind of meeting new people and technically kind of joining the dots. And so that's what I wanted to kind of share with you today and give you a bit of an insight of, as well as explain a bit more about towards the end in terms of the so what. So why call it docs and boxes? So as I was preparing for this, I was thinking about what I would kind of try and get across as the messaging and how we based on meeting people and kind of joining dots and creating a broader kind of understanding system. And it reminded me of the game that you might use to play if you're bored and all you've got with you is a paper and pencil, and you might be waiting for kind of your plane to go on holiday or something like that. And it's called Dots and Boxes. So there's a bit of a video here that kind of may remind you about it if you don't know what I'm talking about. But the aim is effectively to join the dots and own as many boxes as possible. So the purposes of this kind of, kind of framework, I suppose, I see joining the dots is about learning new things and meeting new people outside your usual box of knowledge and experience. And then filling in the boxes is when you get it. It's not where you kind of understand the theory. It's actually where you start to really get a good feel and understanding as to that element that was outside of your normal box. Normally somebody else's box, but you're starting to kind of really understand what it likes to feel in their world. So that's the framework that I thought would actually kind of help in terms of getting across what I'm kind of trying to share with you today. The dots and boxes bit is part of it, but it's also about sharing my story. So storytelling is part of it. And like I say, it's kind of a bit about how I built up my boxes, but then also the drivers that have helped or picking on the moments that allowed me to join dots outside of my usual area of comfort. So that's a bit about kind of the framework and the introduction. But another kind of thing I reflected on was why pick boxes? You know, when you think about boxes, they're good sometimes in terms of when you apply them to engineering principles, they can provide clarity, clearly defining what's in scope. But sometimes you could think about it in terms of a box can be quite limiting. It's kind of very focused on what's inside, and you might ignore some of the outside influences. So while I was thinking about this, I realized that my kind of learning as an engineer actually instilled this as a way of working. It reminded me of some of the early lectures that I was having at university at Sheffield, and in particular, one area which was it was in the fluid dynamics lecture, and the lecturer was start to explain some of the basic principles of kind of aerodynamics and lift around a wing. And as we were kind of starting to get into it, the first thing he said is the first thing you need to do is define the system, effectively draw a box around it. And then you got into the kind of, you apply the laws of physics. So in this case, it's kind of the law of conservation energy. The total energy of an isolated system remains constant. The air goes over the top. It has to go a further distance, but all the air has to go through the box and come out the end at the same time. So it goes faster. It ends up in reduced air pressure, and therefore you get an upward force. But I'm not here to kind of talk about the principles of aerodynamics or lift on a wing. It was really the fact that it kind of said, to make it simple, to kind of keep it within a scope that kind of helps you to kind of describe it, put a box around it. But also recognizing then, the wing is part of a bigger system. It has multiple control surfaces. It's a storage device. It's a fuel tank, so the weight will change as it travels. It's load bearing. It holds the engines. It's attached to a fuselage. Flies in conditions that change, so the wind is not always going to be kind of laminar or kind of steady. And then it interacts with other planes, or it's not supposed to. It's trying to avoid with them, and then it interacts with the infrastructure airport. So kind of you started with one neat little box which kind of describes lift, but then when you kind of build bigger and bigger onto it, you realize that actually the system is actually quite complex and large. And so that's kind of where I thought, so the habit of using boxes is quite common from an engineer. It's a natural trait, I suppose, for engineers. It's neat in terms of helping you to grow your knowledge and experience in a defined area. But the trick for successful engineers is to work out how to join the dots outside their box or their area of expertise, and fill in those boxes in order to be able to represent the bigger system. So that was me, just to kind of, as part of the intro, just to kind of, I suppose, set the scene in terms of what I'm going to talk about next, which was how did I get here? So how did I fill in my traction and rolling stock boxes? So that's where, as I shared earlier, it started in terms of T&RS, and it started in summer 1990, where I had a summer placement at Heaton Depot. And see, these are some of the pictures from that time. I actually had to kind of get the photographs, the physical ones, and take photos of them to turn them into digital ones to be able to share them. And that was the type of assets that were around at that time. Some of them, we've just been talking about earlier. So they were around for a long time. But there's also some of the people there as well. And so you can see some of the maintenance systems that were used when I was at my placement. There is a computer in the background I can see, but there's more telephones and files there than you might see in an office these days. So it is genuinely from the 90s in terms of a Heaton. But the thing I can tell you is the reason or the driver for me there wasn't because I was interested in the railway industry or I was interested in trains. Actually, the driver for me was I needed to have a degree. And while I was at Sheffield University, one of the requirements in terms of graduating as an engineer was that you would have a summer placement. And the university was very closely linked, well connected to the rail industry, as it is today. Sheffield is still part of the UK Rail Research and Innovation Network. And they were able to offer me the opportunity to go and have a summer placement at a depot of my choosing. And I chose Heaton because, again, it was local to where I lived at that time. So becoming part of the railway kind of family and then starting my railway career was probably more fate or luck than actual kind of initial motivation or personal driver from myself. Like I said, it's very much driven by a need to kind of to be able to graduate. But in summary, it was a 10-week tour of the various depot functions, technical office maintenance, and all the usual stuff that you'd hope somebody would try and get out of a short placement. That then resulted in me being able to fill in more T&RS boxes, because when I then did graduate in 1992, I joined as a graduate trainee. And the photos that I've shared here, again, show photos from that time, are capturing three things that I really wanted to kind of share and reflect on. So my graduate colleagues, so top left and bottom right are a number of them. But what I've found is that at least half of them are still in the industry, and about a third are still in the UK. Those who aren't in the UK are kind of being rail engineers around the world. So for me, that was kind of really quite kind of great to kind of be part of that original kind of group, and also to recognize that some people, similarly to me, kind of stay in the railway industry for a lot of their career. The second part of the pictures, the top right and bottom left, are my first project. So when we'd finished our induction activities, in Derby at the time. We were asked if we would be interested in volunteering to do some special research work that was being led by the research centre within Derby. The time of year was autumn, and the research was all about leaf film, and it was all about studying the impact in terms of track circuits impact and loss of track circuit as a result. Didn't know much about it myself in terms of the significance of what I was looking at, but when I look back now, I think actually that's really it's almost like kind of serendipity, because my first project was looking at the wheel rail interface, so already kind of starting to see different parts of the system and look at them, granted in a very kind of naive way, but the first exposure was exactly that. And the third thing that happened at that time is what I've called my first revolutionary driver. So this was my experience of something that had quite a dramatic influence in the direction of my career. What was that driver? Basically, after shortly joining the rail industry in British Rail, probably about 3 to 4 months, rail privatization was announced. Seemed to shake a lot of people who'd been in the industry for quite a bit, in terms of it was a time of kind of uncertainty, but having just started in the rail industry, didn't really appreciate the significance of it, and didn't panic, and thought, okay, let's just see what happens. Obviously, I had the point, it was a decision point in which I could have thought, no, don't want any of that, move on, go do something different, or actually, which is what I did decide to do, was let's go with it and see what happens, which I'm very pleased to do. So in carrying on, in seeing what happens, my first third of my career, as is described, was with what I would call T&RS organizations, but mostly kind of centered around Neville Hill. So I got to know the depot very well, and also some of the visitors or the fleets that were based there. Interesting point here about the photo. I wasn't using a drone at that time. It is definitely a photo from that time, but it wasn't drone footage. It was from the lighting tower at the one end of the depot. The reason I was up there was because it was part of my plant placement within the graduate training period that I was there. I was up to kind of check on the components that were up there, but I also took the opportunity to take that photo. But yeah, so I just thought I'd share that in terms of compared to, and that's what it looked like at that time. And these are my early T&RS boxes, the components that I started to get to know and love through understanding what it meant to take care of them on a daily basis, cleaning, regular level 4 maintenance, and then finally level 5 overhaul and major components. And for those of you who are in the room, and I know there's some very experienced people in the room who understand these far better than me, they were all ultimately the components that went together to enable, you know, the HST to be able to do what it did or does in terms of being that broader kind of T&RS system that I started to get to know more and more about. And the final thing to say, it wasn't just high-speed trains that I got a sprinkling of. The depot was actually 2 boxes, or a box within a box. There was 2 businesses, and there are still 2 businesses on that site, and different types of trains and the types. And again, I'm conscious that I'm preaching to the people who know exactly what they're all about. So I will kind of just reflect on the fact that it wasn't just engineering that I also kind of got the opportunity to kind of learn from and develop from. It was about team management, shift management, you know, materials, logistics, working with contractors, and ultimately ending up competing for work in a privatized industry. So nearly 10 years of joining the dots and pretty much completing what I would term my T&RS engineer box. At the end of that time, so 2000, feeling quite comfortable in what I'd done, who I knew, my world, I suppose, in terms of being within the traction and roller stock engineering world, and also had a clear understanding of the scope and parameters of working within there. Or so I thought, because what I then did next was I reached out into what I would call the track box. So when I'm talking about track, I don't mean track as in the basic components of track. I'm talking about the broader infrastructure. But to keep it simple, we can talk about a T&RS track. But yeah, the driver here was very much a personal one. I had an appetite for continuing to join more dots. So when you're the depot manager at a depot, what could you do next? So I had a look around, and I thought, right, okay, that there are some other aspects of the industry that I think I could be able to do. And I wasn't thinking any big steps. I was thinking a nice, easy step, a small step where it would be a simple stretch of my T&RS engineering requirements. So I went for a planning role within at York. And there was a different driver there. There was a family driver as well in terms of why it was York, because at that time, while we were living Leeds, Newcastle, which is where home was for both myself and my wife, was very convenient. We had a 3-year-old, nearly 4-year-old son. So being near enough to relations, family was helpful at times, but also it was a nice distance where having a 2-hour gap between you was also handy sometimes, in terms of allowing you to do your thing. So the driver there, or the instructions there, was no further south than Leeds, and York fitted that bill quite neatly in terms of it was just a long search to the east. However, I didn't get the job, but something else happened. The driver changed. So in terms of it initially being my motivation to want to do something different and try something different, the organization, which was Railtrack at that time, spotted that I had the ability to broaden my own application or my own understanding of what the industry looked like. But where the way they thought I could do it was by being a delivery manager for parts of their infrastructure. That certainly wasn't on my agenda. It wasn't part of what I thought was kind of a natural next step in terms of reaching out of my box. But they thought there was some, their understanding was, the engineering principles are very much the same, just the assets are different. And so they offered me a role, which was as a maintenance delivery manager as part of the East Coast Main Line. So this involved being brave on a number of factors. Firstly, managing infrastructure. Really wasn't sure that I could kind of take what I knew, having been at Neville Hill for 8 or 9 years, and apply that to the world of managing infrastructure, track, overhead lines, signals, etc. There was the next dynamic in terms of the geography here, and again, most of you will understand the geography. We have Newcastle, which is home up here. We have Leeds, which is where Neville Hill is, and my job was in Peterborough, which is down here. So that parameter of no further south than Leeds kind of became challenged, shall we say. And so that was kind of, again, increased the level of kind of, I suppose, braveness that was the decision that we were making, both not just me as an individual, but us as a family. And then the final element to it was I was going to be working for an organization that was, at that time, referred to as the infrastructure controller. And to be honest, having worked with them, came across as a bit of an infrastructure controller, maybe a bit brutish in terms of having as a reputation. So there's also a nervousness there in terms of do I really want to be going to work in an organization like that? However, all that stuff stacked against why you want to do it, we actually ended up doing it, being brave, like I say, and we stepped into the world of the track boxes that I managed to kind of start to reach into. So the role. Oh, sorry, yeah, I'll go back a slide. The reason I was in Peterborough was because my patch effectively was this purple line, which was the first 100 miles out of King's Cross of the East Coast Main Line. So as part of that, I got 2 depots, which was great. Okay, so there is some common features. One was at Hitchin, and one was at Peterborough. So there are some similarities in terms of what I just come away from in Leeds. And also the note here, this is not a photo taken from a lighting tower. This is taken from another tool that they have in their box, which is the helicopter. So quite exciting stuff there in terms of new tools as well as new people and places. But actually, the rest of it was quite similar. The people were very much like-minded railway people. Asset management is very similar. Their inspection and maintenance regimes have periodicities, they have engineering limits and tolerances, have intrusive, non-intrusive, testing, ultrasonic testing, all stuff that I actually could relate to, but it was just on different assets. But the best part was they tended not to move. So while some of the challenges I would be facing at Neville Hill was making sure that the trains that we needed to see the next day came back, and they didn't stop off at another depot. With infrastructure, it's normally where you left it last, like I say, normally. But so my world there turned into trying to understand more about geography, and being able to know all the locations where all the assets were, as opposed to being able to rely on them coming back home on their own. But in reality, I didn't leave my T&RS box either, because every now and then I would touch on it. So there would be occasions where, as part of kind of managing the infrastructure, something would not work as required in terms of some of those interfaces that we talked about earlier in engineering, and it would come a part of it. And it was for me, these were those trigger points that actually prompted people to talk to each other, but actually have technical conversations. But the point is, you don't want to be having too many of these events that prompt that conversation. You want to be trying to have these conversations without having to kind of wait for something to not work. So that was where I started to kind of join some dots from the organization that I was in, that enabled my own engineers to understand a bit more about how the traction rolling stock works, and vice versa. The idea being that we were able to avoid these types of events because we had a better understanding of how our respective worlds worked and how they interfaced. So when I talked about this, I said there was drivers involved, but there was also experiences or catalysts that helped me to think about things differently. And there was, whilst I was on the East Coast Main Line in the maintenance delivery organization, there was at least one occasion where there was almost like a kind of a shift in my thinking, but it was prompted by an interaction that I had with one of my engineers. So I had a number of engineers who supported me. So whilst at that time maintenance was carried out by a contractor, I had my own engineers, a track engineer, signal engineer, EP engineer, civils engineer, etc., to be able to kind of support me in the management of that. And I found the track engineers quite easy to get on with. There's a lot of commonality, I suppose, in terms of, a lot of the stuff that they do is mechanical engineering. So we had a good kind of able to build up a good relationship in terms of common areas. But I also got a real feel for the challenges that they deal with, and especially when and we go out track walking and see the assets with them. But there was one particular day when my favorite track engineer, somebody that I still know, they came back after a day of track walking, very frustrated, and they'd been reviewing their job bank. And I can remember really clearly now. He said to me, he says, "When you maintain your wheels, do you work to the same ridiculous limits as we do?" So note that your wheels and we references. So clearly ownership was kind of what he was inferring there. But the point he was trying to make was, he's trying to manage an asset with some really tight tolerances on it, and he was finding it difficult to do. And he was just really kind of curious as to, how does that work from our perspective? And it made me think, because my immediate answer was, actually, I don't know. But I was able to, go back and kind of reflect on and actually kind of engage with people from the, the wheel lathe that we had at Nibble Hill. And when I kind of, got my old records out, I realized actually we do. When we're managing, and what he was talking about effectively was the kind of the interface. And the dimensions are exactly the same. They're just flipped. And for him to not realize that in terms of him doing his job, and me to actually kind of not realize it immediately and kind of make that connection until we actually had the conversation, it made me realize, I hadn't thought of it in that way before. I'd kind of be very much focused on this, my side of the kind of the system, as in the T&RS side, never really understood what his work was like. And now we're starting to get a real feel with the kind of things that he was challenged with in terms of trying to maintain that as an asset, in terms of the flip side for it. So for me, that was one of those moments where the penny really dropped, and we shared almost like an emotional passion and an engineering passion, as opposed to just getting the physics of it, and maybe the standards that go with it. So that was one of those moments that allowed certainly that kind of understanding and like I say, filling in some of the boxes. There was a second incident, which was Hatfield, but I'll come back to that, because there are kind of the consequence of that unfortunate incident that happened in 2000 that I also come across later on in my career. So I will come back to that, but just hold that as a thought, but recall that it was at a time when I was responsible for maintaining that part of the infrastructure. So whilst I was in that role, and starting to join a lot of dots in terms of having dewirements and various other conversations about wheel lathes and wheel profiles and track damage and stuff like that, I became known as the T&RS connection within my team and within the zone actually. So the L&E zone at that time, I was kind of joining a lot more dots and helping people, not just at Neville Hill, but Bounds Green and also Craig and Tinney, in terms of understanding how some of the interfaces worked and we could understand each other's worlds. But I then started to get really curious about it in terms of saying, well, if I'm doing this in the zone for L&E, who's doing it in other zones? I'd asked the people, I'd asked kind of my leaders within the L&E zone, and they said, we don't know, but you carry on doing what you're doing. It's really good what you're doing. So I kind of carried on, would wait for time to pass and assume things would kind of move on and other people would start doing it. But it did seem to me it was just myself that was doing it. Until, ironically, the IMechE came into play when I came across somebody through something that the IMechE had done, which was one of the conferences I attended, but I also noted that one of the presenters was the head of traction rolling stock in Railtrack. So I didn't know there was such a person, but they were doing a presentation. So I went to the IMechE, registered for that seminar, and saw that person. It was a lady called Sylvia Wasserman, now Sylvia Cherber, and she was talking about the wheel rail interface and the work that they were doing. And I took the opportunity to go and talk to her, so joining a dot, even within my own organization. I went up to her and asked her that question. I said, who else does this in Network Rail? I explained to her how I was doing it in the Northeast Zone, but couldn't find anybody else in Network Rail who's also doing it, so they could join up and work together. And her answer to me was, well, nobody currently. Would you be interested? And so now so the driver here was my own curiosity, had actually resulted in me then moving into something different as part of my career, which was working within that team and creating an organization that was a group of interface engineers. So some of you in the audience kind of may remember them, so this was my mission that I ended up, I suppose, creating, because of that simple question. It turned into a bit of a task, and like I say, a mission, and it was to create a team that had traction rolling stock knowledge inside an infrastructure management organization. It seemed there was a very small amount of it, and most of it was focused kind of from a policy and engineering perspective. Not a lot of it was focused on doing the stuff that I was doing, which was ultimately kind of talking to the T&RS kind of engineers in interface. And hence this team was one that grew over a number of years. Their mission was to be solving technical performance issues at the train and infrastructure interface, but trying to do it without getting bogged down in commercial and contractual issues. And that was really, made it a very certain type of engineer who was able to kind of deal with that, because the engineering is the one thing, but once you're kind of getting into the nitty-gritty of problem solving and you've got the engineering sorted, how do you resolve it? And that's sometimes not just the case of engineering, which is what I wanted to share with you now in terms of using a couple of examples. So far we've talked about the impact of T&RS or trains and the impact on the track engineers, assets, his tracks. Well, the kind of stuff that we would also get involved with as part of the interface engineers organization is we would deal with the occasions where the track influenced the train or impacted on the train. And so we'd get involved in a number of technical investigations. And there was a couple of catalysts for me that kind of, again, caused the penny to drop again and really kind of understand from a different side of the equation what was going on in terms of the motivation, I suppose, that changed my thinking on terms of how the system worked. So the example I've got is one that was up in Scotland. It was Rutherglen Station. And what you're looking at here is the station. And what you can see is that it's a very sharp bend. And it's so sharp, it's got check rails, and obviously requires quite a high level of maintenance because it's going to be subject to a lot of wear, certainly on the outside rail. What had happened here and what we got called in to deal with was that the ScotRail, which was the train operator at that time, was having problems with their flange wear. They would normally kind of have to maintain their wheels or take them to a lathe tie turning, flange wear flange thickness. If they did have to, it would be 12 to 18 months between turning. What they all of a sudden started to see a change as a result of something changing somewhere was they were running out of flange thickness within about 4 weeks. It was 1 or 2 vehicles that were experiencing this problem, and they needed to understand what would happen. When we got involved in the investigation, this is the location of concern. And what was happening was the track engineer was just doing their job. The track engineer was very conscious of the wear that they have on the outside rail. And one of the natural thing to do as part of following the process and the standards for maintaining the condition of their track was to transpose the rail. So swap them around, swap the outside for the inside one. So you're reusing the material, you're reusing the kind of the components. You just swap them around, and now your wear has been, the wear is on the outside of the other rail, so it isn't an issue. Clearly, it created a problem for the train in terms of all of a sudden, the profile that it got used to running on had now switched to a regular profile, a new profile, and then it caused that massive wear. Obviously, there are other factors there in terms of, lubrication probably wasn't working at that time. And we had to kind of understand how to solve it. And this is where kind of, whilst we understood the technical issue, we then needed to convince the right people in terms of how to fix it. And so working with the train operator and the sponsors and the asset managers and the budget holders within Railtrack at that time, we were able to kind of work it out, sort it out in terms of finding the right solution that was a combination of lubrication and then monitoring with longer term friction management. But again, it was another thing where the track engineer was just doing their job, hadn't really thought about it in terms of the impact it would make to have the site, to foresight to say, actually, we're doing something here. Train operator, you might need to kind of be conscious of that. And yeah, you kind of don't realize that that level of kind of appreciation isn't down at that kind of working level. The other part of that time was spent talking about again the wheel rail interface. But it was focused around WILD, so wheel impact load detection systems. These became a very key focal point for us as interface engineers, because whilst when they originally were put into place, they were actually perceived as being something that prevented trains from doing what they need to do, which is be moving passengers or freight around. As we got to understand more about them and how they work and how the information that they produce could work, they've ended up being, over time, actually quite good systems for providing proactive wheel condition maintenance. So I wanted to kind of just use a bit of take an opportunity to kind of share with you what's happened within Network Rail in terms of how these systems work. But it kind of goes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of my first job in Railtrack at that time, where again, out with my track engineer, on doing a track walk with him. It must have been autumn time. A long freight train passed us, and it had, in quotes, loud flats as it went past. So no real kind of a way of kind of confirming how much of a flat it was. It was just loud in terms of the track engineer's mind. And he turned around and said to me, "See what we have to deal with? Your train's breaking rails." And so I said, "Okay, so what do we do here?" And this was, like I say, back in the time when I first joined Railtrack. And he said, call it in. So I called up the maintenance control and said, said who I was, described what had just happened, and they said, "Okay, right. So where are you?" And so I had to ask where I was, or still working on it. And then next question, okay, so which train was it? So I says, okay, well, it was going that way, the one going north. So yeah, so my knowledge and terminology were kind of not up to scratch, perhaps. Ultimately worked out which train it was. And then the next question was, so which wheel was it? And that's when I thought, right, okay, if I was in the depot receiving a message of poor, tread damage on a train, go and investigate, and that's the train and it's one of those wheels, yeah, the chances of being able to do a kind of a robust kind of check on it are going to be limited. And that's again when I thought, okay, right, so I'm, it's almost like reflecting on when I was in the pit world, as it were. Actually how difficult sometimes it is to join those dots in terms of knowing what's going on. So that's where the systems that we have now actually help to kind of join those more effectively. And this is just a quick run through. So I wanted to kind of share this with you because, like I said, when I first experienced it, I did ask my track engineer, so what about these valve systems? They did have one, but it wasn't commissioned yet. So 20 years later, this is what some of those systems look like. And I'm conscious John Redhoff's in the room, and you know all about this. So I will kind of, and again, I don't intend to kind of go into great detail about what these systems are all about, but basically, there's a lot of data, and it has three abilities really. One is it captures and stores that data. It has the ability to provide an alarm, so it's kind of can be quite live and reactive if it kind of has certain exceedances. In terms of the loudness or kind of the size of the damage, the size of the impact. But then actually, if you join that information up with having data tags or on the vehicles, you can then start trending that information and ultimately enable traction and rolling stock user to be able to manage their maintenance based on the information that's getting from systems like this. This is how it's made up. This is how it does what it's capable of doing. The original systems were based on wire strain gauges wire strain gauges. They now use fiber optic strain gauges effectively, and what it's doing is measuring the bend in the rail as a result of the impact on the wheel, and they can capture this information, and it uses a number of sensors which can capture for wheel rotation. These are the components that make up that system. And if you talk to anybody about this in terms of what is the impact of wild, pardon the pun, a big influence has been in terms of rail brakes, because this chart is showing you the number of brakes that have been on a national basis within the infrastructure manager, whether it be Railtrack or Network Rail, and how it's kind of changed. Wild hasn't done that on its own, but the thing that kind of really I started to realize more eloquently was that it's not about the braking rails that is the issue. Ultimately, that's when it's kind of gone wrong to the nth degree. But the track engineer is often dealing with defects that are in their rail. Some of them were there when the rail was made, and so they're using ultrasonics to kind of monitor those and manage them to the point of whether they remove them at the right time, because they will naturally kind of grow over time through normal usage. However, wheel impacts cause those cracks to grow faster, but if it isn't managed properly, then it kind of becomes a break. But what I started to see was the track engineer having to deal with increasing numbers of defects that were growing faster than they can cope with. So it caused a lot of kind of tension, stress there in terms of trying to be able to manage it. All stuff that I could never see as a traction and rolling stock engineer and didn't appreciate and didn't have a real feel for. But what it helped me to think was, I can remember when at a time, when I'd be looking at maintaining a night shift, and we'd be having reports of defective wheels, and it would come in, we'd have a look at them, and we would be thinking about it in the context of, yes, okay, there is some damage there. Actually, we've got a service to be running. It'll be okay to do another. And I remember doing that. And I remember having no concept of what the consequences were in terms of the world of the track engineer. I was thinking very much about, will it kind of be so significant that it causes a problem, either wheel damage, wheel breaks, or it breaks a rail. I wasn't thinking about some of the more kind of lower level kind of consequences that I was causing as a result of the things that we were making decisions then. So that for me again was reflection of, whilst I was in my T&RS box, sometimes I thought I understood what we were doing, but really didn't think about it kind of outside of that element until I'd met the people and seen what their world looked like. The system can also look at imbalanced loads, and this is where the system, the wild system, joins up with other data sources, and again reduces another type of risk. So it's just that kind of enhancement of how it can get more out of the system. And also got to recognize that it's not just about infrastructure monitoring trains also monitor the infrastructure, and we've got the dedicated ones, which is the yellow HT, but actually a lot of the new trains that we're kind of building today and putting onto the system, they've got their own kind of systems for monitoring their own capabilities, but as a consequence, they also then start to give us the information which allows us to understand the condition of the infrastructure asset. And we have a program of about called intelligent infrastructure, which is about trying to do more and more with that to be able to kind of. Okay, so sorry, I'm kind of conscious of time and where I am in terms of the message I'm trying to kind of share with you. So I want to come back to that point where I talked about earlier in terms of the catalysts for realization, so we say, while I was in the maintenance organization when I first moved over to Railtrack. and that was in relation to Hatfield. So Hatfield was one of those drivers which was thrust upon me. And I came across it in two ways. One was the day of the incident. So I'd been in the job for 3 weeks. So I had left the comfort of Neville Hill, took on this new role, and was faced with this. I remember there quite clearly. I was at Huntingdon on the track, looking at doing some asset surveys with my track engineer and my signal engineer. Their pagers went off. Yeah, pagers, we didn't have smartphones yet, so that was the most effective way for doing mass communications, and the message was derailment at Hatfield curves. My track engineer understood the significance of that. I was completely kind of naive, didn't potentially even know where Hatfield was, but we stopped what we were doing and we were on site within 2 hours. And this is another one of them moments where, kind of, got to admit, I had a few wobbles. You know, a lot of things going through my mind. Okay, what have I got myself into? How do I deal with this? Is it too late to change my mind? I even had a call from my previous boss from Neville Hill, calling up to see how I was, and if there's anything you can do to kind of help. But also, if I wanted it, I could come back to Neville Hill. However, again, it was one of those kind of opportunities where I kind of could have made a decision, could have kind of got out of there, but no, let's find out more about this. And we've made a very big decision to come here in the first place. Let's not let this kind of setback. Let's kind of work out what we need to do here. And so that's kind of when joining quite a few boxes started. At that time, my role was very much about operational recovery, so I didn't get involved in the investigation as much. It was more about kind of getting the railway back to operational kind of performance. But I did get involved in it in a more detailed way when I joined the central team with Sylvia, and started to kind of get more of an appreciation of some of that research work as well. But basically, it was kind of, that was the trigger event, a very unfortunate event, you know, with fatalities to have, but it didn't just allow me to join a number of dots very quickly and boxes. Actually, from an industry perspective, it did that, to the point of where we have cross-industry committees that deal with this very type of thing. So I didn't want to kind of, I'm certainly not taking any credit for this stuff that I'm about to share now, but it would be remiss of me not to mention all the great stuff that's kind of gone on, which is effectively what I've been talking about here, which is joining dots and completing boxes at quite a kind of a focused interface, you know. So the wheel rail interface, it is, you know, it's intense. It's about the size of a 50p coin, but there's a lot can go on at it, to the point of, you know, those people's boxes is a very tight and intense box. And I think I do remember kind of once or twice hearing them being referred to as crack addicts, as they were trying to understand more and more about rolling contact fatigue, which isn't a unique thing to railway. You know, I've looked up in terms of, you know, the definition of rolling contact fatigue. It's defined as a failure or material removal driven by crack propagation caused by the near surface alternating stress field. So for us, in terms of a wheel rail interface, this is the kind of stuff that the research kind of identified. It's about where that contact patch is between the wheel and the rail. I'm not planning on going into any detail here about the engineering behind this, but what I did want to kind of recognize was that different modes of generating the crack or getting the crack growth, and some of those modes were based on train design. Some of them were about the track geometry, so the infrastructure side of it, and some of it was about the wheel rail interface, so the profile management. So really a very genuine kind of subject area of understanding how to join those dots, in order to understand how to deal with it, and how to prevent a tragic accident. And that there was a number of things that came out of it, which are shared in these slides here. Part of it was about profile management, but there was also about, you know, looking at reprofiling or changing the profiles of some of the features of our assets, whether it be the wheels or the rails. So for me, it was kind of one of those things where it was very much kind of a put upon or a thrust upon kind of catalyst for change that affected both me and my career, but also I imagine a number of people's careers, even in people in the room here today. But again, it's about not having those, not relying on things like that to prompt that. that's what I'm kind of trying to kind of get across in terms of my messaging. Final thing before I kind of come out of the interface engineers part of this conversation, it's about what I would call the box comfort. So having done a lot of this stuff, kind of got involved with some of the research, got to know the track engineers and the signal engineers really well. Now starting to feel really cocky, perhaps. I started being asked to come and talk about what it is we do as rail interface engineers. Actually, this is where the IMechE comes back into it again. I was asked to present at one of the centers. It was the Southwest Center. What I was trying to do there was I was trying to explain to them, some of the drivers for why, the infrastructure manager does what they do in terms of seemingly making it quite difficult to kind of fit the train into what effectively is a box. And I drew it as a box in terms of, if you fit it within the box, it'll be fine. Trying to, yes, maybe oversimplify it, but trying to also recognize, that what looks like kind of unusual behaviors is because there's it's quite a challenge in terms of what you're doing in terms of defining that box. And just trying to kind of give that perception to the traction road stock engineers for an understanding as to what was going on inside the infrastructure manager. It was when we got to the Q&A that I had another kind of, I suppose, a memorable moment where somebody in the audience wasn't asking me a question. They were just kind of, and it was a more mature member, a more experienced member of the audience. They described how that when they were at school, they were taught to think outside the box. And for me, kind of, I had no answer for that because actually they were quite right. I'd actually become quite insular in terms of the way I was thinking about my kind of world based on what I kind of had done in terms of my own kind of joining the dots together, and had then maybe got too comfortable within that kind of box to the point of actually not thinking about the outside of it on a regular enough basis to kind of appreciate that actually things do change, and it will never kind of be the one kind of defined box, as it were. And it was around about that time that I was able to bring all the boxes together. As Louise mentioned in my introduction, an opportunity came along. So this is where the opportunity was to be able to, all the boxes that I'd gathered up in terms of my knowledge of the railway and a bit of the system, I got an opportunity to kind of use them all. But what happened here was, it was something where I couldn't identify how that would work. So the driver here was, I was looking for the opportunity, but I didn't know what it looked like. And when it passed me, it was like one of those things where kind of, when you see, when you see something go by, you do a double take. It's kind of like, when you know what you like, for say from a car or a bike or a house, you know the features you're looking for, but you've not seen one before in order to know what you want. And when that thing goes by, and you look at it, you can do two things. You can say, "Oh, that was interesting. Not seen one of them before," and carry on. Or you can say, "That was interesting. Where can I get it?" And this is what happened when Network Rail at that time was trying to deal with changing European legislation, which basically meant interoperability was coming. Well, in fact, interoperability was there, but what was happening really was Network Rail was running out of ways to avoid interoperability. And so the conversation within the company I was working on about was, hey, what are the things that we can be doing? And one of those elements of it was to create, at the time, was going to be the designated body, but ultimately turned into something that is a subsidiary company that still exists today. That was the network certification body. And I did that role for 7 years. It was the longest I've been in the same role, and that was because there was so many jobs to join. I was able to get back into my T&RS kind of roots, but there was more than HSTs and DMUs. There was plant and freight too. And then I also managed to kind of start to see some of the infrastructure engineering projects as well. Stations, airline equipment, new bits of railway, never mind new station. But while doing this, whilst I was also kind of getting a lot of opportunity from it, I also started to see an interesting thing that was going on in terms of the types of engineers that were really good at doing the role within a certification body. Quite often, the ones who are more experienced in terms of their their understanding of how the system worked and the application of the principles. So whether they've been doing design, or whether they've been doing maintenance, or whether they've been doing kind of construction, the greater the breadth of experience they had, the better they were at being a conformance engineer, to be able to kind of understand what they were looking at and to be able to work with our clients. For developing engineers, you know, whether it be kind of young graduates or people who were new to the railway, not as good a place to kind of get that breadth of understanding, because what you've been faced with is somebody else doing it, not you actually practicing it yourself. And what I started to see myself doing was a similar thing to what had been done to me when I first kind of joined Railtrack, in terms of they said, actually, we think you should do this. I started to kind of say to engineers who were developing ones, and particularly graduates, yep, definitely kind of come to NCB in order to be able to learn about stuff, but actually don't stay too long, because you have so much more to kind of get from doing other jobs. And I would draw the line at about 3 to 4 years, and I'd be saying to them, right, actually, I think you need to move on now, to the point of sometimes maybe had to push the people in order to them to go out and join the dots out there. And my message to them would be, go out there and come back in 5 or 10 years time, where you'll have built up your kind of your understanding and your kind of a feeling for how it really works, and you'll be a great kind of engineer within our organization. So I was starting to kind of give a bit of a push in terms of encouraging those. And as well as kind of doing the engineering stuff, the role, because it was a subsidiary business, it relied on its reputation and its ability to do a good job and have returning customers. I kind of got a real kind of experience and understanding of what makes good customer service. I described it there on the slide as a bit of non-engineering stuff, but in reality, actually, good customer service is also good engineering as well. So that's the other kind of the breadth, I suppose, that I was also going to be able to do. So coming back to that position I kind of talked about at the beginning, when I said, who am I? Whilst I'm head of design in Network Rail, actually I feel like a traction rolling stock engineer. Hopefully what I've shared with you now helps you to understand a bit more about why I feel like that. But also I've shared with you kind of the sense of, actually, I do have a good appreciation for what the other stuff is, but actually I feel most comfortable when I'm with the T&RS world, as it were, despite being in my current job in terms of what I'm currently doing in Network Rail. So having walked through it like this, I now want to kind of go into the so what, and it's about kind of bringing all the boxes together. So when I look at my career in a different way and reflecting on it in terms of some of those drivers, so we talked about some of the stories I shared with you. What were the drivers for change, whether they were thrust upon me or whether the ones that kind of I motivated. This is a diagram that represents my career. The start is on the left, where I joined British Rail, and it's not the end. It's the where we are today. We're talking about something called Great British Railways, and I've done them as big circles and little circles, because there have been some quite revolutionary changes in terms of going from British Rail to privatization. Railtrack to Network Rail was quite an evolutionary change, and then we're just coming out of another one, really, which is Brexit and COVID, two a bit blended together. The one we're most familiar with at the moment, or most kind of focused on, is COVID, but Brexit is still there in the background. And what we're moving on to is Great British Railways. So this is where, based on the stuff that I've seen, the stuff that I've been talking about, yes, there's going to be those cycles of change. And even within those cycles, there are mini cycles, so routes have gone into zones, and it's kind of decentralization, centralization, things that will kind of flex in and out of those big revolutionary changes. But each of those changes, they create a huge opportunity from an engineering perspective to make sure the lessons that we've learned don't get lost. And in particular, when we're talking about kind of going from what was a nationalized industry to become privatized, what we've kind of learned in a privatized way is a lot of that kind of innovation and technology that that the competition has promoted. We definitely don't want to lose that when we kind of get into something that might be perceived as a bit more nationalized. But at the same time, some of those barriers that were created in terms of being able to have those conversations with the engineers without kind of getting too kind of hung up or caught up on the commercial things is another thing that we want to make sure that we kind of get out of moving forward. So how can we make sure this happens? Part of it will come from the experience of the leaders in our industry. So I work for Network Rail, and Andrew Haynes is the chief exec of the company I work in. But he's also a key feature of Great British Railway and the transformation that's kind of going ahead. And he's already starting to share his thoughts. So just to be clear, what I'm talking about here are his thoughts as the chief exec of Network Rail, and it's his thoughts on what reform looks like. And he's described it, what he refers to as the 3 S's. But instead of trying to describe what 3 S's are for you, I'm going to let him tell you himself.
But I've used 3 S's to describe my vision for rail reform: simplicity, sustainability, and separation. Simplicity first. We want a railway that is simpler, and that means being more agile, a railway which is less bound by contractual obligations and long-standing, out-of-date customs and practices, but one which is adapted to increasing shifts of demand from our rail users. An ability to work together in true partnership between track and train, and not being driven by contract. When we're at our best, we already do that. But all too often, we're bound by contractual procedures. Sustainability. Well, of course, that means many things. It means being affordable, but also a service people want to use. Being more user-friendly, embracing technology, and of course, ultimately and profoundly, putting the railway's green credentials centre stage. And the last S is about separation. And by that I mean being clear on roles and responsibilities, separating the politics from the job of running a customer-focused railway. Yes, being relentlessly committed to delivering on the priorities established by ministers, but having sufficient separation to get on with the job we know we can do best.
Okay. So I had the opportunity of hearing that a few weeks ago, and when I heard it, for me it was kind of, okay, it's a good start. It touches on some of the things we've talked about today. He talked about bringing track and train together. Talked about keeping it simple, being able to talk technical without getting contract. So I think great. We've got people talking about the right things based on what I understand from my own experience in terms of what we're heading for. But what does that mean for me and you and the IMechE? So this is kind of why I focus, I suppose, what I focused on in terms of my role, or what I will be focusing on as part of as being the chair of the rail division in the IMechE. It's all about how can we accelerate the way people join the dots and boxes quickly and effectively. So this is what I'm looking for in terms of from you to help me with as we make the most of the changes that lay ahead as we create Great British Railways. And then there are 3 parts to it. So what could you do as an individual? And I'd say to you, really look to join the dots and be brave. So go looking for it. Learn. See opportunities that allow you to learn outside of your box, and also don't stay comfortable too long. For those of you in the room who are part of an organization, look to kind of inspire and release your people. So sometimes people are really good at what they're doing. You tend to like to keep them where they are because you know that they're really good at what they do and they really help you in delivering, in achieving the things that you're looking for. So sometimes this can be quite difficult to do. And it's all about kind of not limiting the appetite of your engineers. And sometimes you might need to be pushy in the same way that I talked about with the graduates in NCB, kind of encouraging them to go off and do something that might mean they need to be a bit brave as well. And then the final thing as engineers. So as a mechanical engineer, it's about collaborating with professional engineers from other disciplines, understanding what their world is all about, and actually maybe even think about doing their job. Thank you. That concludes my chair address and presentation to you.
Thank you, James. Do you want to stop sharing?
I have done, yes.
Great stuff. So at this point, I'd invite everybody to turn the cameras on where they can. We've got a good amount of time for questions, and I'm sure James will be giving some good answers as well. So if you would like to ask a question, there's more than 2 screens, well, more people on the call that I can actually see at any one time. So if you'd like to use some of the buttons that are available to you on Zoom, the easiest way is to drop your mouse down to the bottom of the screen. You can use the participants button, and then you should have some different buttons to be able to press to attract my attention. Failing that, wave vigorously at me, and I'll do my best to make sure I keep swapping between screens to see you. So without further ado, could I have who would like to ask the first question? I will.
That's it. Richard's got a party popper. Is that...
Go on then. Off you go, Richard. Unmute yourself as well.
I couldn't resist. I've had all these buttons to press. Don't know how to get rid of the ta-da now. Thank you, James. Really, really interesting, and it's fantastic to see that the vision that the British Rail recruitment and training process had of producing fully rounded railway engineers who can, play their game in every sector, every part of the industry, still coming through. One of these days we'll remember how to do that. Maybe that's another S, some skill that's needed. Just a quick question more about your current role in the design side. How do we make sure when you're designing something in one part of the industry that we have it joined with the other bits, and that the combined system, that's one of Andrew's S's, I think, actually produces the outputs that the specifiers and funders anticipated? I have to say, we do have a tendency as an industry to spend a lot of other people's money building some really nice stuff, and then having to explain to them why it doesn't actually work, or we might have actually made things worse.
Yeah, I can answer that. So that's kind of the difference in terms of output-based specifications, I suppose, in terms of not designing to it based on what you think you want, but actually what it is you're trying to achieve. And yeah, I recognise what you kind of refer to there in terms of some of our past experiences and history has suggested that we haven't been able to do that together very effectively. But what I'm seeing, certainly from within the part of the organisation that we have got that clarity, I suppose, is that is changing to the point of where even having the conversation about, is bespoke design better than standard design, and vice versa, because standard design is seen as the kind of the economic kind of kind of way of doing something efficiently, in terms of you just kind of repeat, whereas actually when you go bespoke, there are so many things that you can do that give you benefits, whether it be sustainability benefits, for example, when you kind of do something that isn't just trying to fit the standard model onto something where it won't fit. So yeah, so I think there is that capability to do that. I think part of the stuff that we talked about in terms of breaking down those barriers or bringing track closer to train is part of the solution. But don't get me wrong, I think there are some very good things that we have been doing over the last few years that helps to get better. When we talked about kind of information sharing from trains and infrastructure, and also some of where those interfaces come from. But there's a long way to go. But I think things like speed and all the kind of sub themes to that are going to kind of change the way we think about it, in terms of instead of going from remits that are, did you build me one of these, it's kind of, this is what I'm trying to achieve. What do we make?
Okay, thanks, James. Right, who's up next? Or am I going to have to ask one of my chairman's privilege questions? Go on, Nick.
Hi, Nick.
Right,
Good to see you.
James. Hi, James. Yes, how are you?
Very
yeah, I
good.
have. Yes. So, yeah, I mean, I've come from a similar background to you, engineering management trainee, started in traction and rolling stock, and moved into electrification and plant, bit by accident, a bit like your career. A lot of my career is you look back on the decisions you made, you think, well, that made me now. So I empathise with the joining the dots principle. I think the systems engineering concept, we must hold on to that. And maybe Greater British Railways will allow the engineering community to draw closer together. There's still the contractual and commercial interfaces that are separating us a bit, although we're in this community here and IMechE and we talk to each other. I still think in our businesses it's a bit adversarial, and the contracts and commercial stuff get in the way. So I do empathise with Andrew Haynes' aspiration to break down those commercial and contractual barriers, but I don't underestimate that's quite difficult. There'll be lots of lawyers and accountants making quite a lot of money about this change, and that's not good for the industry. We've got to get slicker, faster, but we mustn't lose sight of good engineering, and that'd be a challenge for all of us.
Yeah. So I recognise there's no question in there, but one of the things I would say is that what I am trying to do, and then almost kind of take advantage of the fact that I am in Network Rail, is get us as professional institutions working together to try and inform that stuff. So very, very keen to, as part of what we're doing, to get all those, the ICE, IRSE, kind of all those different professional engineering institutions aligned, because we've now got a common goal. Is kind of how do we make sure engineering in Great British Railways is doing the right thing that we all know it needs to be doing, and instead of being disparate different voices, let's join those voices together. And so being part of the IMechE helps me to do that, but also being in Network Rail helps me to do that, because there are some people in Network Rail who are kind of similar to me, kind of lead some of those institutions through the 10 years as presidents, chairs and stuff. So I think I can join lots of dots because of all the network I've got.
Yeah, so my question is pace and speed. Do you think that's an opportunity to do this better, or are we going to get pressurized on cost and time and shortcut the good stuff we've been talking about? I've
got to say it's going to make us better, but the key to success is the behaviors have got to change. So that whole kind of guerrilla thing I talked about in terms of what things were like previously, that's no longer there, but it takes a long time to kind of turn into something else. And speed will, all the themes that underpin speed, they're almost kind of obvious principles, but it will only happen if the behaviors are able to change to kind of get into the spirit of what they're all about. And to be honest, that's what I am trying to do, but it's a difficult thing to do from, sometimes some people struggle to kind of veer from what they've lived and breathed for years and the standards that they kind of covet. Sometimes that might make life a bit difficult.
Yeah, and I'd emphasise, I'm an electrification engineer, but I understand something about rolling stock and pantographs. It's trying to get the rolling stock engineers to work with the overhead line engineers, and your de-wirement issue is really, this interface is quite important. We get it wrong.
Yeah, good job. This is in a virtual environment. Physical.
Yes, but thank you very much. Yeah, very inspiring talk. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick.
Jolly good. Right, I've got two hands, but I didn't see who came up first, so I'll go in alphabetical order. H for Hother. Steve, do you want to go next? You need to switch your microphone back on, Steve, as well.
Sorry, I'll start again. Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Good. If all else fails, read the instructions.
Yes.
Super talk. Thanks, James. I just wanted to pick up on the Rutherglen case you quoted, not so much on the details. It seems to be a case of loss of corporate memory, which, as you get older, I suppose you spot more examples. I was in Scotland, or just before the West Coast electrification, so I'm talking early 70s, and there had been a huge problem with the original suburban electric trains with flange wear and, surprise, surprise, side cutting on rails. This was mainly there were two separate systems, north side and south side. And it had been solved almost at a stroke by fitting sessional and flange lubricators on the actual trains, which
Yes.
for the time was quite revolutionary within BR. I'm just wondering, I may be guessing, it sounds as if that knowledge is lost, or maybe rather Glenn was something special, I don't know, but how do we get over this problem of problems are solved, people move on, 10, 15 years later, the same problem comes up and everyone's forgotten about it? Is there an answer?
So I would like to say I think there is, or I hope there is, largely because of some of the stuff that I managed to kind of draw on in terms of for my presentation today, because I was able to easily find it. So it wasn't just stuff that I had stashed in my own kind of records that I brought through today. So some of that Vehicle Track System Interfaces Committee stuff, it is information that's readily available in a public environment. Because I think that's where sometimes we lose that when the individual go, they'd have loads of stuff in their garage, and then when they kind of weren't part of the railway, you kind of lose that kind of those reference kind of material. So I think there are things about the way our world is today that means that we should be able to kind of make that knowledge easier to kind of remind ourselves on. There is always the risk then that we kind of have too much and we have overload, but it's as an industry, I think our challenge would be to kind of how to make that easier, so you're not wasting your time trying to find the right stuff and not relearning those lessons. But I also think the system is continually evolving. So that whole kind of thing where I kind of felt I was in my comfortable box and I knew everything, or I was kind of getting a bit cocky, you know, the environment around us changes as well. So sometimes what was a solution you know, a while ago actually might not be the right solution today. And so often kind of wary of trying to put, oh yeah, we did that before, and just kind of patching it on and realizing you haven't actually kind of got to what the real root cause was, and then looking at how would you solve it now based on, you know, the technology that are currently available and what we know and we've learned in terms of, in that case, you're talking about management of wheel rail friction. And yeah, you know, there's lots of things that we could look at in terms of, you know, so the underground has you know, vehicles that kind of do the self kind of wheel lubrication that we could probably draw on. But I also know that kind of the other European countries do similar things as well. So it's kind of about knowing that the principles kind of don't get lost, but not at the same time not kind of trying to patch an old lesson learned onto something that may be a new problem. So yeah, so not an easy answer, I'm afraid. But yeah, I'm hoping that it becomes easier to kind of store that corporate memory and not rely on somebody with all the documents or the experiences in their shed or their garage or their loft.
Jolly good. I think that's a good answer too, James. Right. So then the next one, Nigel, would you like to ask your question?
Hello, Nigel. Long time no see. Good to see you. Well, when you put your camera on.
The freshly retired Nigel, I should say as well.
Yes.
Hi, yes. Evening, James. Nice to see you again.
Yes, and you.
It's a bit of a question on a similar theme. How do you see the voluntary scheme that's just in the process of doing affecting this Great British Railway? Because I have a real worry that we are going to lose huge amounts of experience out the industry. And that is probably the challenge to make sure we keep the knowledge, because there is knowledge there, and you know, reflecting back to when we separated the railway in when we created Rail Track, there was a huge amount of knowledge went away there, and there were all sorts of problems that came from it. So, you know, just your thoughts on how we manage that.
So I think there's three elements to that, because yeah, you're right, I have thought about it in terms of, you know, somebody kind of with my experience and knowledge and recognizing what the risk is there. So one of them is actually some of those people would have retired anyway, you know, so that we would have to kind of deal with that kind of loss at some point. So and what this has done is probably accelerated it by 2 or 3 years to some extent, and they will retire. You know, they will say, actually, I've had enough. I've been thoroughly enjoyed what I'm doing and giving a lot to it, but actually I'd now like to kind of live a different stage of my life. So there's an element of you're kind of flushing that out sooner rather than later, as opposed to kind of coming across it later when GBR kind of comes into fruition. The other part is that it is a scheme that is an industry scheme. That means that actually the answer might be no. So there's a benefit there in terms of if the organizations that are going through this process, if they're sensible about it, they can say no as well, in terms of they recognize that actually there are some niche skill sets and capabilities that actually you want to keep for the future. That's going to be a brave decision, I suppose, because you're right, there's the whole kind of driver to say actually the industry can't afford to be operating its current costs. So how do you kind of make sure that you've got the right costs for the right people? So that's kind of the second kind of opportunity, I suppose, in terms of making sure you don't lose some of that corporate knowledge. And then the third one is actually those people who've been in a part of their box for a while. This is an opportunity to do something different. It's not being kind of done to you in terms of it's a compulsory redundancy as in be pushed out of an organization. It's an opportunity where somebody can say, actually, let me have a look around and see what else there is, because we're coming into a time where, yes, there's a lot of change due, and the people who are going to be leading some of that change will be looking for the experience and knowledge that the industry has. And so some of the people that are saying, well, actually, I fancy doing something new, but I don't plan on stopping work. I actually want to do other stuff. The best thing we can do as an industry is make sure we keep in touch with those people and draw them in and point them in the right direction of where they can actually do something different, but bring their knowledge with them and be able to kind of inform the stuff that is going to create the different elements of what Great British Railways will be. So I think there is some tough stuff there in terms of we might be bringing forward some of the people who are ultimately going to go, but I think as a network of as an industry, there are some things that we can use this as an opportunity for as well.
Yeah, just following on from that, James, obviously the other risk is the bit of a void that sits behind it, because you must have been almost the last management training intake that BR did.
Yes, I think there was just one
there between there and when the industry grew up a bit more and started to take other people on again. But as an industry, we really haven't been taking enough people on.
Yes, I can't argue with that at all. And that's where I would say as professional engineering institutions, that's got to be one of the messages we put across to the transformation team and the people who are going to be describing what it looks like, to say, that whole kind of scarce resource type stuff. As an industry in our current guise, we've tried it, we've had successes in pockets, but ultimately it's got to be a key feature to the sustainability success. Thank you, Nigel. And yeah, catch up later.
Yeah.
Perhaps I can build on that and one of the earlier questions, James.
Please.
So if there's a role and a need for somebody that knows a little about a lot, is there a role for somebody who knows a lot about a little anymore? So a deep specialist, you might say.
Yeah, the deep specialist, yes. So those crack addicts I was talking about earlier. Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yes. Oh, absolutely. So the research and kind of those very focused people. Yeah, there are some people actually where they are a good fit for A, what they do, and B, what they want to do. But yeah, how we make sure we don't kind of lose those, that's maybe I don't have the answer too much to, and maybe kind of that's where they're best placed in terms of those consultancy kind of organizations who make good use of that kind of corporate knowledge, and we know how to get them.
I think we need to do some more thinking on that front.
Yes,
the consultancy market is very cyclical, and when it's at the bottom, they'll say, "Cheerio."
Yeah. Yes, you're right. Because if they're not earning, then yeah, they're moving on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay, Stephen, I think we've got time for one last question, and then we need to draw stumps.
Evening, James.
Hi,
apologies I actually missed the start of the talk due to family commitments. So hopefully I won't ask a stupid question that's already been answered by a talk. So I'm going to try and turn it a little bit more philosophical, actually, rather than technical, because I think you're very well placed, obviously, both in your role professionally and in your role at IMechE to answer a difficult question. The Great British Railways are going through a huge amount of change at present, and I'm sure most of us have experienced some consultant coming into business and talking about a change curve. Inevitably, when an organisation goes through the types of change we're going to see, we will see a downward impact to the overall running of that organisation before we see it improve. We're all very positive here, and we've got some great brains around us. We'd like to think the transition is going to be seamless, but in your opinion, and it is just an opinion, sorry to put you on the spot like this, how many years, and I presume the answer's in years, will it be before we actually pass over into positive territory in terms of the overall operation of the new integrated railway?
Wow. Okay. I'm wondering if Andrew's been asked that question.
It's one that you can ask him, obviously, and we'd love to do that.
Yes. So I recognise that it's a lot of the focus is around the transition between control period 6 and control period 7. So as part of some of the stuff that I do get visibility of from within Network Rail, that's where some of the kind of the I suppose the milestones are kind of being defined. And based on my experience, so yeah, very much kind of having seen some quite big changes from whether it be an organization perspective or an industry perspective, I would kind of put my money on year 2 of CP7. So 3 years time, because we got a couple of years to go to finish off CP6, about one and a half. But by year 2 of CP7, I think we're in a position where we'll kind of be getting back up to, we're getting into the direction where we say, actually, this is starting to see what good looks like.
Fantastic, thank you. And hopefully there'll be an awful lot of new graduates that have only worked in the new organisation at that time that adopt the new philosophies. Thanks very much.
Okay. What an awesome question, Stephen. Best yet, I think.
Good. Right. So it falls to me as the centre chair then to do the vote of thanks for James. So it's kind of weird. I can see a lot of similarities and parallels between both the point in time at which we came into the industry, how our careers have evolved, where they've diverged and where they've converged again. I think there's a few key points. I think we might compare notes on our philosophy. So one of those would be my experiences on standards committees, where my observation was rolling stock engineers were very much better at being able to draw a boundary around what they were trying to change and explain and understand why that change was good. Most of the other railway system engineers couldn't do that, and we had to really help them through. So perhaps there's something to export them from rolling stock training. The more I know, the more I realise I don't know. As time has gone by, bee's knees when I graduated, not anymore. So much I don't know, it's untrue. Being able to build empathy with our colleagues in different disciplines and spreading the understanding of the other sides of the different interfaces with a sort of lexicon and a language and an explanation, a way to explain things that helps them grasp the challenges and the opportunities as well that may be there. The impact of a sudden acceleration of a problem and how that really grasps you at the core of your being and really shapes you. I hope that's something increasingly few railway engineers will have to go through, but probably something we all have to deal with at least once in our careers, hopefully not more than that.
Agreed.
So that's the need for understanding at a fundamental level of what you're dealing with, and to be able to engage your stakeholders to solve that problem, because you clearly can't do it all by yourself. Using some good technology to improve our asset knowledge for mutual benefit, and the use of the experience or our own personal experiences, I should say, to improve the results of what we do, rather than just delivering what we've said on the work order. So, goodness me, I said several years ago to a guy from Siemens who was a maintenance manager at Siemens Power, I could have given that what you just said. I could have changed a few keywords and my career would have been exactly the same as yours. Similarly, I could have changed a few keywords in what you'd done and my career would have been exactly the same as yours. So kind of, what is that? X-Files, does that come from, or some other TV show? I don't know, but there we go. So thank you very much, James. It's been a fascinating evening. We had some good questions and some excellent answers in response to those questions with a very good audience as well. So everybody, I appreciate not everybody can do this, but I'd like to thank James in the usual way, or wave your hands, or do whatever you do with virtual meetings these days. So thank you very much, James.
Thank you very much. Okay, great to see you all and to be here.
Indeed. So just as a final advert, 10th of November, we have 2 speakers, one from East Midlands Railways, one from Porterbrook, to talk about a project on a turbostar to upgrade parts of that to be more sustainable, cost less to run. And it's an Innovate UK sponsored first of a kind project, which I think will be absolutely fascinating. So that's Ian Williams and Nick Lamb. I'm really looking forward to it. Spread the word, because this is an important project. We've got a lot of diesels. They're going to have to keep going for a while because the wires won't go up instantly as much as we might like them to. So bring your friends, tell your friends, and don't give them an excuse not to come. So we'll see you on the 10th of November, everybody. Thank you very much and good night.
Good night.
Thank you, Louise. Thank you, James.
you. Good night.
So,
Thank you. Thank you, James. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, James.
Yeah, my pleasure. I'm just reading the chat now that I can catch up with this.
See how old we all are.
Totally not.
1973 for me.
Ooh, I think you get the prize, John.
That makes me feel better.
I think
thought I was the
Steve
old
Further
one on
might have
here.
beaten me. Had
Yeah,
he,
just a
Do you
very
remember that
young guy.
photo I was in Cape Town? I think that was probably around about 1973.
Oh, no, 87 when I joined BR, so I feel like a young man now.
yes, it doesn't seem that long.
No, can
Sure
imagine.
it doesn't.
Anyway, good night.
to look at a 91
everyone.
gearbox.
Right.
Thanks, Louise. Really appreciate that. Thank
You're
you.
very welcome, James. Thank you.
See you later. Bye.
Everything seemed to work as required.
Yeah.
So that's excellent.
No, I'm getting practice at it. Like I said, confident and competent.
Well, you'll be really swish by the time you get to the last one.
Absolutely. Okay.
It's time to go around all over again.
Bye.
Good night, James.